Tonight, you'll discover why a medieval wedding could last for days, why some brides carried garlic instead of flowers, and why one simple kiss in church meant your entire future could change forever. Hidden beneath beautiful dresses and joyful celebrations were strange customs, unexpected fears, and traditions that still echo in weddings today. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and allow yourself to drift back nearly 800 years. Tonight, we'll quietly wander through medieval villages, grand castles, and tiny countryside churches as we explore how ordinary people celebrated love, family, and marriage in a world very different from our own. Tonight, as we quietly step beyond the church doors and into the everyday world of medieval Europe, it becomes clear that marriage was rarely the simple love story we often imagine today. For many people living between the 12th and 15th centuries, a wedding was not just about two hearts finding one another. It was about families, land, reputation, survival, and the future of an entire household. Love could certainly grow over time, and some couples genuinely cared for each other. But the decision to marry often began long before the bride and groom had much say in the matter. Imagine living in a small English village where everyone knows your name. Your father farms a few narrow strips of land, your mother bakes bread in a communal oven, and nearly every family nearby has known yours for generations. In a place like this, marriage isn't simply a personal choice. It is everyone's business. Parents spend years thinking about suitable matches. They consider which family owns healthy livestock, whose fields are productive, who has a respectable reputation, and which marriage might strengthen friendships or settle old disagreements. A good marriage could make life easier for everyone. A poor one might create hardship that lasted for decades. Among wealthy nobles, the stakes were even higher. Marriage could unite kingdoms, secure castles, prevent wars, or create powerful political alliances. Sometimes children were promised to one another while they were still very young, with the actual wedding taking place years later when they reached an appropriate age. To modern ears, this may sound surprising, but in medieval society it was viewed as a practical way to protect family interests and ensure stability. For ordinary villagers, arrangements were usually less grand, but just as important. A marriage meant another pair of hands to work the fields, care for animals, manage a household, and eventually raise children who would continue the family's work. Yet even in arranged marriages, history reminds us that affection often developed over time. Medieval letters, poems, and court records reveal husbands grieving lost wives, wives praying for absent husbands, and couples building lives filled with companionship despite marriages that had begun as practical agreements rather than romantic ones. Once a wedding day finally arrived, it was impossible to keep it private. In fact, privacy itself was something medieval people experienced far less often than we do today. A wedding belonged to the whole community. Neighbors gathered outside homes before sunrise. Children followed the procession simply because it was exciting. Old women whispered advice to the bride. Farmers paused their work. Merchants watched from market stalls. Even strangers passing through a village might stop to witness the celebration. Church bells echoed across the countryside, announcing that another marriage was about to take place. Their deep, steady sound carried over fields, forests, and rivers, inviting anyone nearby to share in the occasion. The ceremony itself was usually held at the entrance of the church rather than deep inside it. This allowed everyone gathered outside to witness the exchange of vows. Weddings were public because marriage affected inheritance, property, and community life. Having many witnesses helped prevent future disagreements about whether the marriage had truly taken place. If you were expecting sparkling diamonds, elaborate jewelry, and luxurious wedding bands, medieval reality was much simpler. Most ordinary couples exchanged rings made from iron, bronze, or modest silver. Gold was reserved mainly for the wealthy. The ring itself mattered less than the promise it represented. Once placed upon the finger, it became a visible sign that two people had entered a new stage of life together. Many rings were plain and undecorated. Some carried tiny crosses. Others featured simple engraved patterns. few would have looked anything like the brilliant gemstone rings we associate with weddings today. The bride's clothing might surprise modern eyes even more. Forget the famous white wedding dress. That tradition would not become widely fashionable in Europe until many centuries later. Instead, medieval brides simply wore the finest garments they owned, or could borrow from family members. Blue was admired for its association with purity and the Virgin Mary. Green symbolized youth and new beginnings. Rich reds appeared among wealthier families. Brown, gray, and natural wool colors were perfectly acceptable for ordinary villagers. A wedding dress was rarely worn only once. Fine clothing was valuable, carefully repaired, and used again for festivals, church services, and other important occasions. Owning a garment beautiful enough for everyday use was far more practical than creating a dress meant for a single day. The timing of a wedding was also carefully considered. Life revolved around the farming calendar. Spring demanded planting. Summer required endless work in the fields. Autumn brought the busy harvest. Only after crops had been gathered and food safely stored did many communities find time to celebrate. Late autumn and early winter became popular seasons for weddings because families finally had a brief moment to rest. There was food available for feasts, ale had finished brewing, and neighbors could spend time celebrating without worrying that precious crops might be left unattended. Every detail reflected the rhythm of medieval life, where nature quietly decided the calendar more often than people did. And then came the vows. Today, we often imagine that a wedding only becomes official after the ceremony inside a church. Medieval law, however, could be surprisingly different. In many parts of medieval Europe, especially in England, two unmarried people who freely exchanged present-tense marriage vows before witnesses could be considered legally married, even if no priest had yet blessed the union. Those few carefully spoken words carried enormous weight, which brings us to one of the most remarkable stories preserved from the Middle Ages. Sometime during the 13th century, a young English couple eagerly made their way toward church to be married. Whether from excitement, nervousness, or simple misunderstanding, they began speaking their marriage promises to each other before reaching the priest. Friends walking beside them heard every word. Several neighbors witnessed the exchange. The couple likely believed they were simply practicing what they would soon repeat during the ceremony. But according to church law at the time, those spoken vows themselves were enough to establish a valid marriage. By the time they finally reached the church doors, they were, in the eyes of the law, already husband and wife. What should have been an ordinary wedding instead became the beginning of years of legal arguments over exactly when and how the marriage had truly taken place. It is a gentle reminder that in medieval Europe, words carried extraordinary power. A simple promise, spoken a few minutes too early, could quietly change two lives forever. Imagine that the morning of your wedding has finally arrived. The first light of dawn slips quietly through the tiny wooden shutters of your family's cottage. Outside, the village is still wrapped in a cool layer of mist. A rooster crows somewhere in the distance, followed by the soft bleating of sheep waiting to be led into the fields. You wake earlier than usual, long before most of the village has begun its day. There is no luxurious bridal suite, no professional makeup artist, no photographer arranging every detail. Instead, the familiar smell of wood smoke fills the room as the fire is gently brought back to life. Your mother is already awake, carefully stirring a pot of warm porridge while your sisters whisper excitedly in the corner. Today is unlike any other day you have ever known. Your wedding dress is folded neatly across a wooden chest. It is not brand new. In fact, it may have belonged to your older sister, your mother, or perhaps even an aunt before that. Good cloth is far too valuable to wear only once. Every stitch has been carefully repaired over the years, and every faded thread tells a story of another celebration long ago. As your family helps you dress, there is no perfect mirror waiting nearby. Perhaps a small polished piece of metal gives you only a blurred reflection. You smooth your sleeves as best you can and hope everything looks respectable. Beauty, after all, is less important than honor. Your mother gently places a simple linen veil over your hair. It isn't covered with sparkling jewels. Instead, it has been washed carefully, pressed by hand, and saved for special occasions. For wealthier brides, the clothing might include velvet, embroidered silk, or fur trim. But for most women across medieval Europe, fine wool and clean linen are considered more than enough. Around your neck hangs a small wooden cross. Perhaps it belonged to your grandmother. Perhaps it is simply a quiet reminder that today's promises are believed to last for life. Outside the cottage, the village has slowly awakened. Neighbors begin gathering along the narrow dirt road. Children peek around fences, eager to watch the celebration. Older women smile kindly as they offer blessings. A few men joke loudly while pretending not to notice how nervous the groom looks. In a medieval village, almost nothing remains private. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone has watched you grow up. Today, they all become witnesses to one of the most important moments of your life. Soon, the slow ringing of the church bell echoes across the countryside. Its deep sound rolls over green fields, small streams, and distant forests. The bell announces far more than a wedding. It announces that two families are about to become one. The short walk to the church feels longer than ever before. Unlike many modern weddings, there is no dramatic entrance with music beginning at exactly the right moment. Instead, relatives, neighbors, friends, and curious children all walk together in a cheerful procession. Someone carries flowers gathered from nearby fields. Others sing familiar hymns. A village musician plays a simple tune on a small pipe, while another beats a steady rhythm on a hand drum. Laughter mixes gently with nervous excitement. As you approach the church, its heavy stone walls seem even larger than you remembered. The priest waits patiently near the entrance. He greets your family before turning his attention toward you and your future husband. Unlike today's ceremonies, much of the wedding takes place just outside the church doors, where everyone can clearly see and hear. Marriage is considered a public promise. Witnesses matter. The entire community is there to remember the vows should any questions ever arise in the future. You glance toward the groom. He looks just as anxious as you feel. His tunic has been freshly washed. His boots have been cleaned as carefully as possible. Perhaps he has borrowed a better belt from a relative just for today. For a brief moment, your eyes meet. Neither of you says very much. There is no carefully memorized romantic speech. No handwritten vows tucked into a pocket. Every word spoken today carries legal, religious, and personal importance. The priest begins asking the familiar questions. Do you freely agree to this marriage? Do you promise yourselves to one another? Each answer must be spoken clearly enough for those gathered nearby to hear. A mumbled response could create uncertainty. A missing witness might later become a problem. In medieval Europe, words are not simply expressions of love. They are binding promises. Once the vows have been exchanged, the priest blesses the union. Simple rings are placed upon waiting hands. The congregation quietly offers prayers. Church bells begin ringing once again, their joyful sound spreading across the countryside. The ceremony itself is surprisingly short. Compared to modern weddings, very little time is spent inside the church. The real celebration is only just beginning. As the newly married couple steps away from the church doors, smiling neighbors surround them with warm wishes, cheerful laughter, and playful traditions that have been passed from one generation to the next. Some toss handfuls of grain toward the couple, hoping to bless them with a future filled with healthy harvests and many children. Others offer bread, small gifts, or quiet words of encouragement. The serious ceremony has ended. Now, the village is ready to celebrate. The moment the church ceremony comes to an end, the quiet dignity of the morning slowly gives way to cheerful celebration. The newly married couple steps outside into the fresh countryside air, greeted by smiling faces from every direction. Friends clap politely, children run excitedly between the gathered guests, and somewhere nearby, a musician begins playing a lively tune on a fiddle. The wedding is far from over. In many ways, it has only just begun. Unlike modern receptions held in hotels or elegant banquet halls, Medieval wedding feasts usually took place wherever there was enough space to welcome family, neighbors, and travelers. For wealthy nobles, that might be a magnificent castle with towering stone walls and long wooden tables stretching across a grand hall. For ordinary villagers, however, the celebration was much simpler. A barn freshly swept clean, the home of the bride's family. Or perhaps an open village green beneath the summer sky. No matter the location, everyone contributed something. One family brought fresh bread. Another carried wheels of cheese. Someone arrived with baskets of apples. Others brought ale brewed only a few weeks earlier. In small communities, a wedding feast belonged to everyone, not just the bride and groom. Preparing enough food for dozens of guests was an enormous task. Days before the wedding, fires burned almost constantly. Women kneaded dough by hand before sunrise. Large pots of stew simmered slowly over open flames. Fresh herbs filled the air with comforting aromas. Roasted onions, cabbage, and leeks added sweetness to hearty meals that had taken hours to prepare. If the family could afford it, a pig might have been raised specifically for the occasion. Roasted slowly over glowing coals, it became the centerpiece of the feast, its rich aroma drifting across the village long before the first guest sat down to eat. For wealthier households, the menu became far more impressive. Roasted venison from nearby forests, swans carefully prepared for noble banquets, peacocks served with their colorful feathers arranged once again after cooking to create a dazzling display, fresh fish brought from rivers or coastal waters, sweet pastries flavored with honey, exotic spices such as cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and pepper, imported at tremendous expense from distant lands. These costly ingredients were more than delicious. They quietly announced the family's wealth to every guest in attendance. Meanwhile, most ordinary villagers celebrated with food that was far less extravagant but no less meaningful. Warm bread baked from barley or rye, simple vegetable pottages filled with beans and herbs, cheese made from cow's or goat's milk, smoked bacon saved for special occasions, fresh eggs, butter, seasonal fruit when available, and plenty of ale, because clean drinking water could not always be trusted. For many guests, the wedding feast offered one of the finest meals they would enjoy all year. Conversation flowed as freely as the drinks. Neighbors exchanged stories about successful harvests. Children laughed over simple games played in the corners of the room. Grandparents shared memories of weddings they had attended decades earlier. Travelers passing through the village often added tales from distant towns, bringing news that many guests had never heard before. A wedding became more than a celebration. It became an opportunity for an entire community to reconnect. Soon, the music grew louder. Professional entertainers were rare in small villages, but music itself was everywhere. A fiddler played cheerful melodies. Someone beat a small drum with steady rhythm. Wooden flutes filled the air with bright, playful notes. When instruments were unavailable, voices alone were enough. Guests sang songs that everyone knew by heart, melodies passed from one generation to the next without ever being written down. Before long, dancing began. There were no carefully rehearsed choreographies, no dazzling spotlights, no elaborate stages. Instead, people joined hands, formed circles, and moved together in simple patterns that almost everyone had learned as children. Young couples laughed as they tried to keep pace. Older guests clapped along from their benches. Even those who claimed they could not dance often found themselves smiling before the evening was over. Games followed. Children raced through the fields. Young men tested their strength in friendly competitions. Archery contests sometimes entertained larger gatherings. Storytellers captured everyone's attention with humorous tales, legends of brave knights, mischievous foxes, and clever villagers who outwitted powerful lords. Laughter echoed long after sunset. As darkness slowly settled across the countryside, hundreds of candles and crackling fireplaces filled the hall with a warm golden glow. Outside, the night grew cool. Inside, the celebration continued. Guests ate a little more. Someone poured another cup of ale. Musicians played softer melodies. Conversations became quieter and more thoughtful. For the bride and groom, It was a rare opportunity to simply sit together and observe the joyful gathering around them. Two families who had once lived separate lives now shared the same table. Strangers became relatives. Old disagreements were often set aside, at least for one evening. Marriage was not only the joining of two people, it was the joining of households, friendships, responsibilities, and futures. Some medieval wedding celebrations lasted only until nightfall. Others continued into the following day. Among wealthy nobles, magnificent feasts could stretch across several days, with tournaments, hunting parties, musicians, jesters, and elaborate banquets entertaining hundreds of guests. But whether the feast was humble or magnificent, one feeling remained remarkably similar. For a little while, the hardships of medieval life faded into the background. The endless work in the fields, the uncertainty of poor harvests, the long winters, the constant struggle to survive, all of it was forgotten, if only for a single joyful celebration. And as the final songs drifted into the cool evening air, another set of traditions quietly waited to unfold, customs that may seem strange to us today, yet held deep meaning for the people of the Middle Ages. As the laughter begins to soften and the feast slowly settles into a comfortable rhythm, the wedding enters its most unusual stage. To modern eyes, some of the customs that followed might seem surprising, even a little strange. But to the people of medieval Europe, these traditions carried deep meaning. They were believed to bring good fortune, protect the newly married couple, and ensure a long and prosperous life together. One of the oldest traditions began almost as soon as the bride and groom stepped away from the church. Guests reached into small cloth bags and scattered handfuls of grain over the couple's heads: barley, oats, sometimes wheat if the harvest had been especially generous. At first glance, it may seem like a playful celebration, yet every grain carried a quiet wish, a wish for healthy children, a plentiful harvest, full barns, and a household that would never know hunger. In a world where survival depended upon successful crops, grain represented life itself. Long before flower petals became fashionable, seeds and grain symbolized hope for the future. In some regions, guests tossed dried beans, nuts, or even small fruits instead. Each community had its own local traditions, passed carefully from one generation to the next. The bride herself often carried something unusual. Today we expect bouquets filled with roses, lilies, or elegant flowers. A medieval bride, however, might carry rosemary, sage, lavender, or even garlic, not because they looked beautiful, but because they were believed to serve an important purpose. These fragrant herbs helped mask unpleasant odors in crowded villages where bathing was less frequent than in modern life. More importantly, many people believed certain plants could protect against evil spirits, bad luck, or unseen dangers. Rosemary symbolized remembrance and loyalty. Sage represented wisdom. Lavender offered calmness. Garlic, despite its strong smell, was thought by many to ward off harmful forces that might threaten the happiness of the newly married couple. Whether these beliefs truly worked mattered less than the comfort they provided. Faith and tradition often walked hand in hand. Another custom involved making as much joyful noise as possible. Guests rang small bells. They clapped loudly. Some beat pots, pans, or wooden bowls together. The cheerful commotion was not considered rude. Quite the opposite. Many believed loud sounds frightened away evil spirits that might be lurking nearby, hopping to bring misfortune to the marriage. Even today, echoes of this old belief survive in some wedding celebrations around the world, where horns, bells, cheering crowds, or fireworks accompany the newlyweds. One of the more curious traditions centered around shoes. In certain parts of medieval Europe, the bride's father presented a shoe to the groom. The groom would gently touch the bride's head with it or place it beside her, symbolizing the transfer of responsibility from one household to another. To modern audiences, the custom may seem rather unusual. Yet for medieval families, symbols carried tremendous importance. Every object told a story. Every gesture represented a promise. As evening approached, another tradition quietly unfolded. The wedding bed itself sometimes received a blessing. The priest, or respected family members, offered prayers asking for peace, health, and a fruitful marriage. The bed represented far more than a place to sleep. It symbolized the beginning of a new household and the hope that future generations would continue the family line. In noble households, beautifully embroidered blankets and finely carved wooden bed frames reflected wealth and status. For ordinary villagers, simple straw mattresses covered with linen sheets served the very same purpose. Comfort mattered less than the meaning attached to the occasion. Perhaps the most surprising custom of all involved the newly married couple's journey to their room. Today, newlyweds usually leave quietly for privacy. During parts of the Middle Ages, however, close family members and guests sometimes accompanied them to the bedroom. This practice was known as the bedding ceremony in some regions of Europe. The guests sang cheerful songs, shared jokes, offered blessings, and wished the couple happiness before finally leaving them alone. Although it sounds rather awkward by today's standards, the intention was usually symbolic rather than intrusive. The community witnessed the beginning of a marriage just as it had witnessed the vows themselves. Fortunately, the guests did not remain long. After offering their final good wishes, they departed, allowing the couple their first quiet moments together. Not every medieval village practiced this custom, and historians believe it was more common among noble families and in certain regions than everywhere across Europe. The Middle Ages were never one single, unchanging culture. Traditions differed from England to France, from Germany to Italy, and from one village to the next. Yet perhaps the most fascinating detail is how many wedding customs blended two very different worlds. Christian ceremonies centered on prayers, blessings, and church teachings. Alongside them survived much older folk beliefs that stretched back centuries before Christianity had spread across Europe. People attended church faithfully, yet they also carried lucky herbs. They prayed for God's blessing, yet quietly avoided walking beneath certain trees believed to be haunted. They trusted the priest's words, yet still believed certain charms protected their homes from misfortune. Rather than seeing these beliefs as contradictory, many medieval families simply accepted both. Their world was filled with mystery: the changing seasons, unexpected storms, failed harvests, sudden illness. Life often felt uncertain, and traditions offered reassurance when answers were difficult to find. As the candles burned lower and the final songs faded into the night, these curious customs became cherished memories shared by families for generations. Some eventually disappeared, others slowly changed with time. And a surprising number still survive today, hidden within modern weddings in ways we rarely stop to notice. By now, the candles have burned a little lower, the music has become softer, and many of the younger children have already fallen asleep in the corners of the hall. It feels like the perfect moment to pause for a while and gently separate some of the most common myths about medieval weddings from the reality historians have uncovered. The Middle Ages are often imagined as a dark and mysterious time, filled with strange customs that everyone followed in exactly the same way. But history is rarely that simple. Let's quietly explore a few of the stories that have survived through the centuries. One of the most widespread myths is that everyone in medieval Europe married as children. It is an idea repeated in books, films, and television so often that many people accept it without question. The reality, however, is more complicated. Among kings, queens, and powerful noble families, children were sometimes promised in marriage at very young ages to secure political alliances or strengthen family ties. But those agreements did not always mean the couple immediately began living together as husband and wife. For ordinary villagers, the pattern was often quite different. Many young women married in their late teens or early 20s. Men frequently married a little later, after they had learned a trade, inherited land, or earned enough to support a household. Marriage required resources, and starting a family before having the means to survive was rarely practical. Another familiar myth suggests that medieval weddings were gloomy occasions where no one smiled. The reality is surprisingly cheerful. Life itself could certainly be difficult. Harvests sometimes failed. Winters could be harsh. Illness appeared without warning. Yet these hardships made celebrations even more meaningful. A wedding was one of the happiest events a village could experience. For a few precious days, work slowed down. Neighbors gathered together. Music echoed across the fields. Tables overflowed with the finest food families could prepare. Children laughed. Old friends reunited. People danced until their legs grew tired. In many villages, weddings were remembered for years afterward, becoming stories that grandparents would later tell their grandchildren. Another popular belief is that every medieval bride wore a beautiful white dress, just as many brides do today. But this tradition belongs to a much later period of history. White fabric was difficult to keep clean and often far too expensive for ordinary families to reserve for a single occasion. Instead, brides chose the finest clothing available to them. Some wore blue because it symbolized faithfulness and purity. Others chose green to celebrate new beginnings. Rich reds appeared among wealthier households. Many village brides simply wore their best everyday dress, carefully cleaned and decorated with ribbons, embroidery, or fresh flowers gathered from nearby fields. The important part was not the color. It was the promise being made. Another common misunderstanding is that love played no role in medieval marriages. It is certainly true that many weddings were arranged with practical concerns in mind. Families thought about land, security, inheritance, and social standing. But that does not mean affection was absent. Medieval poetry is filled with expressions of love. Personal letters reveal husbands missing wives who had traveled away from home. Court records describe spouses caring for one another during illness. Some couples began as strangers and gradually became devoted companions over many years together. Others likely struggled, just as some marriages do today. Human emotions have changed very little across the centuries. People still hoped for kindness, still feared loneliness, still dreamed of building peaceful homes with those they loved. There is also a popular image of medieval noble weddings as endless displays of luxury, where every feast overflowed with gold, jewels, and unimaginable riches. The truth is rather more balanced. Great celebrations certainly existed. Magnificent castles welcomed hundreds of guests. Rare spices filled elaborate banquets. Musicians entertained wealthy audiences for days. Yet behind the scenes, noble families worried constantly. Large feasts were expensive. Political alliances could change overnight. A single marriage might decide the future of an entire kingdom. Even the richest households faced uncertainty. A wedding was both a joyful celebration and a serious responsibility. Perhaps the greatest myth of all is that medieval Europe was one single place where everyone lived according to exactly the same traditions. In reality, every region had its own customs. An English village might celebrate differently from a French town. A German family could follow traditions unfamiliar in Italy. Even neighboring villages sometimes disagreed about the proper way to conduct a wedding. The Middle Ages stretched across nearly 1,000 years and covered countless different cultures, languages, and communities. No single wedding represented them all. History, like life itself, was wonderfully varied. As we quietly leave behind the myths and step back into the gentle reality of the medieval world, we discover something rather comforting. Beneath the unfamiliar clothing, the ancient churches, and the curious traditions were people who hoped for happiness much as we do today. They wished for loving families, for peaceful homes, for healthy children, for good harvests, for friends who would stand beside them during life's happiest moments and its most difficult ones. And perhaps that is the most timeless truth of all. Across hundreds of years, despite all the changes in fashion, customs, and ceremony, the quiet hope for a joyful life together has remained remarkably unchanged. As the evening slowly draws to a close, the cheerful voices begin to fade into the gentle sounds of the countryside. The musicians have played their final songs. The last cups of ale have been emptied. Candles flicker softly upon the long wooden tables, their warm light dancing across smiling faces that have grown pleasantly tired after a day of celebration. Outside, the cool night air settles over the quiet village. A gentle breeze stirs the leaves of ancient oak trees. Somewhere in the distance, an owl calls into the darkness, while the stars slowly appear one by one above the rooftops. Families begin their walk home along narrow dirt paths lit only by moonlight and simple lanterns. Children, exhausted from a day filled with excitement, sleep peacefully in their parents' arms or rest quietly against their shoulders as they are carried home. The village that had been filled with music only hours ago now becomes wonderfully still. Inside the bride and groom's new home, the fire burns low in the hearth. Its glowing embers cast a soft orange light across the small room. The excitement of the day has finally given way to peaceful silence. Tomorrow, life will gently return to its familiar rhythm. Before sunrise, farmers will once again walk into the fields. Blacksmiths will light their forges. Bakers will prepare fresh loaves of bread. Shepherds will lead their flocks across dew-covered hills. The busy world of medieval Europe never pauses for very long. Yet something has quietly changed. Two separate lives have become one shared journey. Two families have been joined by promises spoken beneath the watchful eyes of neighbors, friends, and the church. The celebrations will eventually become treasured memories. The music will fade, the flowers will dry, the feast will be finished, but the vows spoken on this peaceful day will remain at the heart of a new household for many years to come. Perhaps children will one day hear the story of this wedding while sitting beside the same warm fireplace. Perhaps the simple silver ring will be carefully passed from one generation to the next. Perhaps the old wedding dress will be folded away once again, waiting patiently until another daughter of the family wears it many years in the future. History is often remembered through kings, queens, castles, and great battles. But the quiet moments are just as important. A village gathering beneath church bells, a shared meal around a wooden table, the laughter of friends, the comforting glow of candlelight, the gentle hope that tomorrow will be a little brighter than yesterday. These ordinary moments shaped the lives of millions of medieval people, even if their names have long been forgotten. And somehow, across the passing centuries, those hopes still feel familiar. People then wished for kindness, for security, for family, for love that would grow stronger with each passing season, just as many people do today. As our journey through medieval weddings and traditions gently comes to an end, allow yourself to picture that peaceful village one last time. The narrow streets are quiet now. The church stands silently beneath the moon. Smoke rises slowly from a few remaining chimneys. The fields rest beneath a blanket of silver light. And somewhere beyond the hills, tomorrow's sunrise patiently waits to begin another ordinary day in the Middle Ages. For now, there is nothing more to do, nothing more to hurry toward, only the quiet comfort of history. Slowly drifting into silence. Thank you for joining tonight's gentle journey through the weddings and traditions of medieval Europe. May these peaceful stories stay with you as you relax, unwind, and drift into a restful sleep. Sleep well. And I'll see you in the next chapter of history.